What's up, pod pals? It's your buddy Adam, and you are checking out Podcasting Business School. This is a show where I teach you how to love your podcast like a hobby, but build it like a business. If you're looking for some podcasting tips on how to launch a podcast, how to grow a podcast, how to monetize a podcast, how to profit with a podcast, we'll get into that today. I've got my buddy Noah Tetzner in here. He's got a great story about how he got launched into the podcasting space at an early age. Now he is obsessed with showing people how to profit with a podcast. And we're going to dive into all sorts of amazing things here today. Noah, welcome to the show, man.
Adam, what a pleasure it is to be with you, my friend. And I say this all the time, but it's so true. I feel like I've known you for years just from listening to the show. And here I am talking to you. So this is a treat.
Super cool, man. That's one of the things I love most about podcasting is you just get to have the most interesting conversations with the most interesting people as often as you want to. And this will be another great example, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So I love to start off the show with a story. I want you to tell me the story about 17-year-old you deciding that you're going to get into the podcasting space.
Absolutely. I too love stories. Well, so back in 2018, that's when I started my first podcast. It was my first foray into the podcasting space. And it all started when I was driving around with my father. He's a real estate appraiser in my home state of Wisconsin. And we would listen to business podcasts, Smart Passive Income, Cliff Ravenscraft, John Lee Dumas, all the legends. And he kind of was telling me, Noah, you should start a podcast. And I didn't know what I was going to talk about. I'm 17 years old at the time, but I had always loved history. It was like my sole passion in life at the time. So one thing led to another, and I managed to cobble some money together and buy a Heil PR40 microphone and a mixer and whatnot, same microphone I'm using now. And I started a show called The History of Vikings. So The History of Vikings was a show, it still exists today, where I would sit down on a weekly basis and interview scholars or historians of the Viking Age. And we talk about Norse myths, stories of, Thor and Odin and Loki, and Viking battle tactics and daily life during the Viking Age. And the people I'd interview on a regular basis were scholars. They were academics from universities such as Harvard, Oxford, or Yale. And my podcast was unique because it was a history podcast, and most history shows at that time were narration based, very much like an audiobook. But what I was doing is I was bringing in world-class experts and curating conversations about a topic that's very masculine and very grab your drinking horn and so forth, grab your battle axe, but I was kind of giving a more nuanced version. So that gave me instant credibility right away. It set me apart in the market, if you will. And within my first 5 months of launching the show, it was generating 50,000 downloads a month. And the rest is history, as they say. So that's just kind of a brief sample of how I got started.
Well, I think your Viking show is super cool. I checked it out. I've got Viking blood running through my veins, and awesome. I'm a big fan of everything, all things Ragnar Lothbrok and all the stories, Bjorn Ironside, the whole thing. So yeah, really, really cool. I think the fact that you jumped in at age 17 is very intriguing because I've got a 10-year-old son that approached me this week about launching his first podcast.
That's awesome.
He wants to do a podcast, a business podcast for young entrepreneurs, and kind of gear 15-minute episodes because that's all his attention span is, of course. But I'm intrigued with just the ability to develop the conversation skills and interview skills at that age. Any tips for younger podcasters out there? Obviously maybe not 10-year-olds, but people in their teens, maybe kids that are even still in high school that want to start a show.
Yeah. Podcasting has changed my life. It's opened so many doors for me, Adam. And the fact that I got started young was just a bonus. So I think if somebody has the opportunity to start a show like your son, run with it. That is so awesome. My podcast and subsequent podcasts have opened so many doors for me. I mean, at a young age, I was literally having these one-on-one consultations with the professor of medieval literature from Oxford, the professor of medieval history at Yale University and so forth. And, through all of those conversations, I learned a lot about the Viking Age is what I was talking about at that time. And then sort of I generated this halo effect because of my affiliation. I was then considered the expert, the Viking podcaster. So that led to features in the History Channel, history.com, the Independent UK, large British newspaper. I've since done a book deal. I traveled to Europe. Like, so many things happened because of my podcast that I got to do while I was a teenager. It was just nuts. And, there's different, obviously the fact that I had a lot of people tuning in was great, but the relationships that you build from your podcast are magical. I mean, whether that's, using your podcast to generate new leads and clients for your business, or it's, just getting selfishly like one-on-one consultations with subject matter experts. So I think young people should just go for it.
Well, I'm already predicting, Noah, that my son is going to pull way bigger guests than I do, like famous people, because of the novelty of having a 10-year-old entrepreneur interview you. Like, I think like we're going to go pretty big. He's a huge fan of Mr. Beast, who's like one of the top YouTubers out there. And I'm like, I bet we could get him on the show if we play our cards right. So anybody that has a connection with Mr. Beast, let's look it up. So you mentioned 50,000 downloads a month with this initial show about the history of Vikings. Can you tell us a little bit of like inside baseball on that? Like, how did that come to be? What do you think were the key things that produced that sort of immediate download production?
Absolutely. And for anyone tuning in who's looking to grow their audience around their podcast, here are just some tips that I would share with you from my own experience. So first and foremost, the topic that I was podcasting about was hot. Hit TV show Vikings on the History Channel was in its golden age at the time. Neil Gaiman had just written a book on Norse mythology. So many people were producing content about Vikings, and it was hot. So I kind of rode that wave in a way and capitalized on that popular interest. Another thing I did is I took a more nuanced approach. So I didn't just produce yet more content about Vikings. I did something unique. As I said, I took this kind of like barbaric, beastly topic and sat down with professors and scholars and discussed it in a nuanced way. I would talk about on my podcast many times how J.R.R. Tolkien, literally, like if you study The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, it is literally like a mirror in terms of like the Norse myths and how Tolkien used this kind of Viking world to inspire Lord of the Rings and everything that we all love that he created. So I took a unique perspective and I capitalized on popular interest. Those are two things. Another thing I did was I established instant credibility. Even before I had 500 people a month tuning into my podcast, I gave them a reason to listen. I was curating conversations with subject matter experts. So in that space, in that history space, those were academics. If you are a consultant or you're a small business owner, connect with people in your niche who are subject matter experts, people that your avatar or your ideal listener would know who they are. So, when I would reach out to guests and try to get them on the podcast, I've had like a 70 to 80% positive response rate, because all I have to do is say, I featured this person, this person, and this person. And, I'd love it if you would be on the show too. So establishing that instant credibility, getting that kind of halo effect that like you are considered an expert and you are considered credible because of who you affiliate yourself with, so important. And then in terms of like making sure the content is unique and it's high quality and so forth, in terms of actually getting those download numbers up, it's all about collaboration. And if you just Googled how to grow a podcast on the internet, people would tell you that, but it's more nuanced than that. So first thing you have to remember is a lot of people, when they talk about growing their podcast, they talk about social media. I rarely used social media when growing my podcast audience. I spent all of my time and energy focusing on other podcasts. So guesting on other podcasts. There weren't many Viking podcasts out there. So I would guest on, the history of Germany, the history of England. And I'd talk about what the Vikings were doing in those countries. I'd also exchange 30-second to 1 minute promo swaps with other podcasters, plugging their shows that we'd have on our shows. So I would just do this constant collaboration. Statistics say that the average podcast listener consumes 7 different shows per week. So if someone's listening to a podcast and it's a similar topic to yours, if they hear about your show on a podcast they know, like, and trust, they're going to tune into your show. So it was all about that. Different distribution partnerships as well, reaching out to like history encyclopedias and saying, hey, if I include links to 3 of your articles in the description of every one of my episodes, would you share my weekly episodes with your 300,000 plus Facebook and Twitter following? Things like that. If a podcast episode went live, not only asking the guest to share it, but then reaching out to their publisher, reaching out to their academic department, reaching out to the university that they represent, thinking to myself, who all could benefit from this episode and who can I ask to share it? So, and I mean, I can get into more tactical things, but just high level, that is like the key to growing an audience. Sorry, that was a little long winded, Adam.
No, it's great. Like that last one, especially coming from a perspective of who could benefit from this content piece by the social proof, the social credibility of that. Who does this help level up? That's brilliant, man. I've never thought of that. And just being on a hot topic, like right now,
Yeah,
I consume a ton of podcasts, and I have a lot of interest in like cryptocurrency, and that's a very hot topic. And I'm like, there's a lot of great YouTube content on crypto. I haven't found that crypto podcast that just lights my world on fire every single day. So like that's something I feel like there's a space, and that's daily. That's something that you can get a ton of downloads on because it changes every single day. So if there's a podpreneur out there that's like, I want to start a show, if you're interested in cryptocurrency, or if you're interested in helping other people learn about it, a daily show with that's going to drive a lot of numbers. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of sponsorship, affiliate sort of deals that could happen. I think that's pretty hot. Is there anything else out there that you feel like is a pretty hot topic that you would love to see a podcast pop up on a certain topic?
Oh, I mean, there's so much out there. I know we're all sick and tired of talking about like COVID and the global pandemic, but truly, like, not focusing on COVID as such, doing a podcast out there called like, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if somebody did a podcast called like the Freelance Therapy Show or the Solopreneur Therapy Show or something like that? And basically the premise is like dealing with, like, talking about mental health topics that relate to the freelancer or the small business owner. And you don't have to be a licensed clinical therapist to do that show. You could talk about the things that like are very tactical, like how to deal with negative client interactions, how to make sure you're protective of your schedule, not trading your hours for dollars and so forth. So I think that could be really crucial, because I mean, whether you've been online making a living like I have for years, or whether, you're new to this, it's just a very different dynamic when you are spending most of your time, and, you probably shouldn't be, but like for example, I have a great work-life balance, but I still spend a lot of my time in the virtual world. So when I step outside, I'm like, wow, like this is real life. Actually, my computer screen isn't real life, but that's one idea.
Yeah, the sun. Look at that. It's out there. Clouds, birds. Yeah,
exactly.
I feel like that sometimes too. And I just go into my interview rabbit hole. I'm just like one after the next. Then I'm like, what happened over the last 6 hours of my life? But no, like I think that's a brilliant topic too. And that's another great part about being a podcaster, is that like we can create these things on the fly. I'm sure there's somebody listening out there that's like, great idea, I've been thinking about that, I'm going to do it. And we encourage you to run with that. Now, speaking of new shows, you've got a new show now that you've got your Viking, the Viking cast. But now you're dabbling into the world of podcasting about podcasting. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Adam. So yeah, my new show, Profit with Podcasting, is just that. It's an opportunity for me to connect with podcasters who are profiting from podcasting, whether that's through sponsorship, whether that's through building relationships with ideal, hard to reach prospects through their show, whether that's through, creating a product and then selling it to a mass audience. There's so many different ways that a podcast can be a revenue generator for your brand or your personal brand. And I've leveraged a lot of those myself, and I love talking with people who just have so many great ideas about what that looks like. And I'm so willing to share my experience doing that. So that's my new show, Profit with Podcasting.
All right. So we got to dive into this nook and cranny here. As you've started to do your interviews for that, as you started to create that content, what are some of the areas that you're like, oh, these are great ideas for profiting off of a podcast?
So there are two main ones that I'd like to discuss, and I'm sure there are people tuning into the show who have made money from their podcasts in different ways, and the opportunities are truly limitless. But the two most lucrative that I personally have experience with are sponsorship and building relationships with potential clients through your podcast. So if I may just get into the first one. So when we talk
Yeah,
about podcast sponsorship, again, if you go into Google and you search for how to get a sponsor for your podcast, personally and candidly, I would say that most of the advice you're going to find is not good. Um, the first thing I'll say is if you're thinking about monetizing your show through sponsorship, you are no longer a podcaster, my friend. Get that out of your mind. You are a journalist who directs a media company. So, Adam, if you think it would be beneficial to your listeners, I recently sold a sponsorship for my podcast, The History of Vikings. And if I could, I'd love to share the initial email that I sent out to get that sponsorship.
of course.
So it goes a little something like this. So, hello, insert prospect's name. My name is Noah Tetzner. I'm a show host and the founder of The History of Vikings, a media company curating scholarly discussions about the history of medieval Scandinavia. The History of Vikings has an extensive reach of 50K listeners a month, 13K followers on Twitter, and 6.5K subscribers on YouTube. Our company was recently featured in History.com and The Independent UK. Writing to you today as I'd love to advertise your products through HOV and think they'd be an excellent fit because of their relation to history. My audience is your target market as it's entirely composed of curious history buffs passionate about the past. I'd love to discuss a sponsorship partnership with your company. I'm a fan myself. If it would be of interest, perhaps we could chat sometime this week. So the reason why I shared that is just I hope people were listening to that and paying attention to some of the key phraseology that I used. The word show host, the word media company, those words are a little more attractive to sponsors as well. Don't really think about selling CPM deals, $25 CPM, because if you've only got 3,000 listeners, that's only $75 an episode. Sponsors and corporate sponsors are willing to spend money with regard to their advertising budgets. You just have to show them that it's worth their while. Don't sell yourself short. Try to package your podcast into some of the other content you're producing, whether that's social media, email lists, etc. Just like I did there. So with regard to sponsorship, that is just the first piece that I wanted to share with listeners.
Well, I love the way that you are packaging things. My friend Allison Melody talks about this a lot too. And it's just like, we aren't just a podcast show. We have newsletters, we have Instagram, we have, live casting, YouTube, all these LinkedIn, all these different mediums.
Yeah.
And all of that is exposure. And the really interesting thing, like I still blame John Lee Dumas for this whole CPM thing. And he really screwed us on this, like this price point. Like I've talked to John a couple of times at podcasting events. I've never brought this up, but next time I'm be like, listen, JLD, you really screwed us on the CPM. $18 to $25 per mil. So per 1,000 downloads. So if you have 1,000 downloads, which 80% of podcasters do not have, then you can get $18. Whoa, awesome. Let me, I can afford to move out of my mom's basement now.
Right.
It's kind of ridiculous. But a lot of these advertisers, like before the age of podcasting, they're paying for radio ads. And let's compare that. Or magazines, way more expensive. Yes. And it's just spray and pray. It's so like broad brush. It's not a specific, it's not niche specific at all. So way more expensive, way less specific. So how in the world, are we going to limit ourselves to $18 per 1,000 downloads? Where if you put 1,000 people that they're like you said, Noah, like the exact right audience. These people are your audience, Mr. Advertiser. That's like a great example. I was consulting with somebody that had a show concept about triplets, having moms of triplets. I'm like, hello, Gerber, hello, Pampers. Like, even if you have 500 moms listening in, that's 1,500 butts that need diapers every single day.
That's right.
That's a lot of diapers. So
it is.
Things like that, you could definitely monetize. So any thoughts around like when you're putting these packages together,
Hmm.
like a price point, if we don't do CPM, how do we figure out what the heck to charge?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the mistakes that people make with regard to sponsorship is not asking for enough money, not because we're greedy, but truly because it's one of those things where, I wouldn't buy a, high end bottle of wine for $5. I just wouldn't do it. The price point in many ways conveys value. And that's something that goes along with your whole phraseology, just seeing yourself as a show host of a media company. So with regard to price point, I always, always, always do package deals, and I always have a minimum commitment. Now, obviously, you want your minimum commitment to be uh, a decent amount of time. So 6 months is great. A year is even better. But most sponsors will want to get their feet wet before they make a long-term commitment. Bare minimum 1 month, bare minimum, because your audience needs some time to warm up to the sponsor and so forth. So with regard to price point, really depends on your audience. I would say that, one, two, three, and so on, $1,000 a month. If you have a really niche topic, you're producing high quality content, you're credible in your field, and you can, relay some good download numbers. Doesn't have to be 50,000 a month, but I would say that is definitely like beyond reasonable with regard to price.
All right. Now, what about just a download number goal? Like
Mm.
what do you think people should just, because obviously we have energy, a
Mhm.
limited amount of energy and time. So we could audience build, we could search out and connect with sponsors. And it's kind of like a pie chart. And if one piece of the pie grows, the other piece of the pie shrinks. So when we're first getting started,
Right.
where's that threshold, like downloads per episode or per month, that you would love to see people cross before they start putting more of that pie chart time into seeking out sponsorships?
Mm, definitely. Um, Regardless of your niche, I would say that if you could get like 5,000 downloads a month, that is impressive. 5,000 people tuning in every single month. And compared, I think one of the things that I struggled with, Adam, when I first started podcasting is, I talk about it now, 50,000 downloads a month. That's pretty good for a podcast. But when I got started, I was like, I was looking at these YouTube channels with like 200,000 views per video. And I was thinking, well, my 50,000 downloads a month is nothing compared to their 200,000 views per episode. Podcasting metrics are way, way, way different than YouTube. And I think most people tuning in know that. But think about it, like 50,000 people tuning in every month. Have you ever been to a conference with 5,000 people? I mean, that's insane. And you have to remember, these are human beings tuning in. These aren't people, faceless people. These are people that you're trying to build relationships with and so forth. So, that's just kind of my subjective number that I've told some of my clients. If we can get up to 5,000 a month, that'd be great.
Well, I love benchmarks like that. I know my audience really appreciates those as well. Just something to shoot for and go, okay,
Right.
that's when I'm going to turn on the afterburners. And another interesting thing that I bring up when I talk to companies that are used to doing like radio ads and things like that, in regards to price, I go, okay, like you buy a radio ad package for $2,000 or $5,000, and the ads appear so many times, but then they're gone. They're gone.
Right.
They're never there again.
Mm.
And I'm like, if I can pull your ad and we do a month of sponsorship or 6 months of sponsorship, my show is bingeable. People go back and they listen to every episode. Those are always there. That is permanent real
Evergreen.
estate, evergreen. And that kind of lights their eyes up. So they're like, wow. So it's very specific to my ideal customer. It's always there. People are going back and binge listening. Now, like your Viking show, any like tips or education based show, that's evergreen. Like my friend Erica Mandy, she's got a news podcast, like even like a Bitcoin cryptocurrency podcast, something that changes every single day, not quite as bingeable. Like I'm not going to go and listen to every episode of the Newsworthy, like news from 6 years ago. Like that's not exciting to me. So that may not apply, but most people have shows that, like, if they're doing their job right and they're curating really unique and cool content, like what we do here, like that's bingeable, and those are always there. That's something that we have to get in front of those sponsors, right?
Right. And I know this is an interview, Adam, but if I may just ask you a question about that, because with like radio interviews or magazine interviews, or excuse me, advertisements, with radio or magazine advertisements, if I'm driving in my car and I hear an ad for something on a radio, I'm going to take out my phone while I'm driving, which is hazardous to my health, type in the URL of the website and then, add to cart and so forth. Whereas if you're doing like a podcast sponsorship, it's all right there for you. All I do is go like this, scroll down, links in the description. Maybe I could even text a special offer to some, SMS marketing scheme. It's just way more like, it's a better listener experience. So, I've wondered, like, a lot of the sponsors I work with, they're really happy because they can measure results through like promo codes that they can give my
Yep.
listeners. I'm assuming, do you do those as well? Because I know that in like magazine and traditional advertising, oftentimes those don't exist. It's just like a blanket advertisement.
Yeah, like that's a key thing with keeping sponsors happy is showing them like this is actually pulling business in. We're not just hoping and praying. Like we can show them download numbers and go, yeah, this is how much exposure you had. But again, if this is the advantage of the smaller show, like my health show, Low Carb Hustle, we don't do millions of downloads. We have a very active, like people trust what we say and they go out and buy. So we're able to pull bigger sponsorship levels because of the results. You can't argue with results when somebody, they hear our ad and then all of a sudden lots of people are going and using our promo code. They're impressed. They're going, all right, we saw a really good profit off of this.
Yeah.
So let's keep the good times rolling here. So that's, if you have a smaller show, if you guys are listening in and you have a sponsor, get a promo code, fight for a discount. Like we need a reason for people to use that promo code. That helps so much. And even if it's like, it's a little bit off of your sponsorship, like, oh, we'll give you a discount code, but we're going to take X amount off the sponsorship. I'd still do that because the likelihood of them renewing is higher if they're seeing the profits come in, and the profits will come in and increase if we give our audience an incentive to use the promo code, not just like, type in Adam because that's my name. It's like type in Adam because you get, a free thing added on or 10% off. That's much more likely to drive some action.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's fascinating. See, that's the key thing is companies care about results. And that's what we're all about as podcasters is we have relationships with our listeners like you never could in another form of like traditional advertising. And I mean, there's so many great ways to interact with listeners, but no, that's great, Adam. I love that.
All right. So we've talked about the sponsorship piece. You mentioned also driving business by attracting your ideal clients, people buying programs, products, and services. So let's talk about that a little bit. What's piqued your interest in that side of the equation?
Yeah. So whether you want to call it content-based networking or podcast-based networking, it's a brilliant strategy that actually I used without even knowing that people were writing books about it and calling that. I mean, gone are the days of going to a conference and shaking someone's hand and handing them your business card. I mean, that's the age of the dinosaur, my friend. But if you have a podcast and you reach out to someone with a beautiful message, letting them know you're a fan and an admirer of their work, and you invite them to contribute to your content, you're giving them free publicity. Everyone wants to be on a podcast nowadays. You're showing a genuine interest in their work, so much so that you're asking great questions and broadcasting it to an audience. That's a great way to build a relationship with somebody. You don't have to do cold emails. You don't have to do cold outreach. These are people who you're building a relationship with by doing a podcast interview. And that's something that's happened very naturally to me. And just to be fair, this isn't like a disingenuous like marketing ploy at all. I'm not saying create a podcast just so you can get leads for your business. I'm just saying it'll happen naturally. An example, I did a homeschooling podcast. I think I did about 10 episodes back in 2019. It was called Lessons from a Homeschooler. I'm a homeschool graduate myself. Homeschooling is a $2.5 billion industry. It's absolutely booming. And on that show, I would have conversations with leaders in the homeschooling industry. So curriculum publishers, content creators, course writers, and so forth. And across those, as I said, I think it was between 8 to 10 interviews. 4 were turned into immediate revenue. I got 2 job offers. like featured in the homeschooling trade publication, which was a magazine, interviews on other podcasts, just because things happened naturally. I mean, in a really niche industry like homeschooling, these curriculum publishers weren't getting journalists knocking on their doors every day. But when I come along and say, hey, I have an audience of like literally your ideal clients, and I invite them on the show and I build a rapport with them by showing an interest in them, afterwards, of course, they're going to say, so what is it you do for a living, Noah? Oh, you do podcasts? Yeah, we've been doing some content creation and so forth. And then the conversation, it's truly like magic. It just happens naturally.
So you sparked an idea that kind of came to fruition out of a conversation I had on Clubhouse, I think last week, about podcasters releasing, shorter, not shorter actual episodes, but like 10 episodes or 20 episodes, with the idea of just like, it's almost like a lead magnet. It's almost like a
Yes.
mini course,
Yes.
and it's really dialed in with the title and the SEO. So it attracts the right people, but you have this out there, and then it's an asset where maybe you teach course creation or something like that, and you do that once per quarter. And then that's kind of the thing that you put out there. You do 10 episodes on your 10 steps to creating an amazing online course. And then you can use that in your email marketing. You can use that on social media and things like that to run people through it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that concept of like, come up with an idea, let's use it almost like just a 10 episode lead magnet?
I love that. I love that. And actually, I have some different things in the works that I'm thinking about creating additional shows in that very vein. Your podcast doesn't have to be this ongoing thing. I mean, just like Gimlet, think of the large podcast networks out there, for those who are familiar with the space producing content. A lot of these shows that they're doing aren't ongoing things. They're just like a television show. I mean, there's a time for everything to end. So don't feel like you need to commit to, oh, I'm going to do a podcast, that's going to support my business and I'm going to do it for 5 years. If 10 episodes is enough, that's great. I love that. A lot of the podcasts I've done, I've only done 10, 12, 20 episodes, and I'm still seen as an expert in that niche. I still have the relationships I've built with people. Granted, I'm not creating new relationships because the show isn't going on, but I have those relationships and I got kind of what I came for, so to speak. So I love it. And if you are doing podcasts closely related in topic, you can kind of funnel your audience from one show to the next. And before you know it, you have 5 podcasts, maybe 4 are inactive, but the content's evergreen. And you kind of have a podcast network going on, which is very valuable.
Yes, a full arsenal of media company content.
Yes.
Now, you've mentioned the word relationships a lot, which I love. And that's how I view a podcast, almost like a funnel, like it's a natural relationship building funnel. We get into their earbuds, they get into our world a little bit, and all of a sudden it leads to business a lot of times. But nurturing relationships, especially when you've got a lot of shows like we do, and there's a lot of plates that we're spinning in the air. I'm interested, Noah, how do you like keep track of your relationships? How are you doing follow-up? Do you have a massive Google sheet like I do, or do you have a system on like, okay, now I'm going to follow up with this person. These are the really, high level contacts that I want to nurture, people that are more like hot leads or something like that. How do you structure your relationship tracking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do use, Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets and create a production schedule. So, per se that has all of my information regarding, not necessarily like, maybe production schedule isn't the right word, but I just have an ongoing list of, the sequence of like communication with a particular prospect or contact, and then where we are, the interview's been recorded. Next week, I'm going to send them a link to the interview that's live. I'm going to ask if we could have a phone call about something, that we talked about in our interview. So I do that. Another thing that I think, again, may sound like common sense, but it really messed me up early on. If you can, as soon as you can, outsource editing and production of your show. Outsource editing and production. Time is our most sacred resource as podcasters. And when you're doing like, especially if you're like perfectionist tendencies like me, I cannot edit a podcast episode because I'll try to make sure every and ah and breath is
Yeah.
out of it. And that doesn't matter. The listener really doesn't care. If they hear you slurping your coffee or your cat meowing, they're going to think, hey, he's a human being just like I am. So outsource that so that you can focus on the high level relationship building stuff. That's one of the things that I found. So literally all I do is sit down, record the content, send a bunch of emails, do Zoom meetings, and then in a few days the content's produced and I can send a link to the guest and it's live. So budgeting your time, I would say, is one of the key pieces.
All right, let's look at the other side of the coin. Now that's something you recommend people to do. What is a mistake that you're seeing happen out there in the podcasting space, or something that you're like, I really wish fewer podcasters would do this?
Mm, mm. Such a good question. I mean, there are a lot of things that I think people should do a little bit differently. One of them being, you have to, a lot of podcasters will rightfully talk about the listener experience, like think about the listener experience, what are they getting out of this? Is the first 5 minutes of your podcast actually something that's going to hook them and bring them in? Or is it just you rambling on about, like small talk with your guests to get kind of that awkwardness out of the way? Similarly, I would say that when you like the overall branding surrounding a lot of podcasts needs help, so if one of the things that I work with clients a lot is, just as we talked about, getting sponsorships and generating relationships with right fit prospects through their show. So selecting the topic of your podcast and the name and the overall brand is so important. One of the things that a lot of people do that limits them is, unless you're doing an educational or entertaining show like My History of Vikings, a lot of people make the mistake of podcasting for their peers or for their colleagues as opposed to the people they want to do business with. Perfect example. I know somebody who is a CPA, and one of his ideal client avatars are agency owners. So he produces a podcast for agency owners. Now, does he own an agency himself? No, but he knows how to ask the right questions and have conversations. If he did a podcast about being a CPA and tax stuff, it's going to be difficult for him to engage with his,
Right.
his prospects. So I think the branding piece is definitely something that we as podcasters just have to think, what do we want the show to do for us? And a lot of people are uncomfortable doing a show that maybe they themselves are not an expert in. Candidly, I was not an expert about Vikings when I started my first podcast, but I had a fascination and a genuine interest.
Yes.
And that led me to ask the right questions because I was literally genuinely interested. Every question I asked, I wanted to know the answer to.
Well, that genuine curiosity, that's so important. And then the branding thing, man, the show title topic, that's one of my huge pet peeves. When I see, like, if I'm scrolling through my Instagram feed or, on a podcast player, and if I can't tell what the show's about because you had some ultra creative, tongue in cheek title that's only funny to you or whatever, like, that's terrible. That's a huge waste, because that's like a fishing lure. And we're both, from the Midwest. It's like, when you have a fishing lure, you want to have something that actually attracts the right thing you're trying to catch.
Yes.
So I love titles that are super bland, right to the point, and you know exactly what it is. Like a frying pan just hit you over the head. Like, I've got a show called Podcast Launch Tips. I wonder what that's about. Like,
right.
That's, like that's podcasting business school. Wonder what that's about.
Exactly.
It's not the obscure everything about everything podcast. Like, it can't, if you guys want to do business, if you want to attract the exact right listener avatar, you've got to be a little bit boring, but it's going to be interesting to the exact right person, boring to the wrong people. That's kind of the way that I put it.
That's exactly right, Adam. That's exactly right.
All right. So Noah, I want to make sure that we can get people plugged in to your resources. Like, you've got some great podcasting stuff you're putting out there. If people want to check out your new show, get plugged into your podcasting universe, where are they going to go to make that happen?
Yeah, man. Well, thanks so much, Adam. Profit with Podcasting, that's my show, available on all podcasting platforms. I love talking with people. I really do. I love sharing advice and tips and learning about people free of charge. This is like my passion. I love it. So if you'd like to send me an email, noah@profitwithpodcasting.com, you can definitely do it. Otherwise, Profit with Podcasting is like, that's my show, and that's the place to be.
That is the place to be. Well, Noah, I appreciate you, man. You're inspiring. I'm gonna make my son start listening to some of your stuff and be like, this guy, he started young too, so you can be
Awesome.
just like Noah. So I appreciate you spending some time and investing in my audience here today.
Oh, thanks so much, Adam. And, thank you all fellow listeners for tuning in. This was a treat. Thanks, Adam.
All right, everybody, gave you plenty of ideas to think about here today about profiting with podcasting. So I want you to think, all right, what could I implement? What could I do? What big idea did I have? And then take action on it. And as always, I'm going to send you out into the world, wishing you health, happiness, and many downloads. We'll see you on the next episode.